All right, welcome to Philosofuture, episode 13, I believe. This is a special one because we're joined by special guest Kruptos. I hope I'm saying that right. And by way of introduction, I just want to say the first time I ran into you, Kruptos, on X, probably Twitter at the time, was an article that I think you wrote that was making the rounds about the managerial church, how
Oh,
bureaucracy has infested, I guess, for better lack of a better description, Christianity, like the denomination stuff. And I was reading that, I was like, wow, shot for shot, that has been my experience, and I've been following you ever since then.
well, I appreciate it. It's one of those things that people don't often consider. It's sort of a combination of the ideas of Jacques Ellul and Marshall McLuhan, so the Canadian philosopher of technology, and among other things. And it our journeys are often long. Like, I mean, I began as kind of a conventional um, post-war consensus conservative, low regulation, global trade, all the normal stuff, right? Family values, small government, low taxes, the whole 9 yards. I had a copy of the debate over the Constitution on my desk, and right next to my Bible. I mean, it like full on the whole cringe thing, right?
Hmm.
And then beginning in 2008 with the market crash, began just re-examining some of my core assumptions, and beginning to challenge ideas like NAFTA, realizing that all those old union bosses here in Canada where I am were right about what was going to happen. And once you begin to acknowledge things like that, the journey sort of begins to unfold a little bit. So I began changing my economic policies and so forth. And then what happens is, I've always used analysis, like Jacques Ellul's analysis of technology, to help understand what's going on in churches. And then I during COVID, a lot of things changed for a lot of people. We ended up doing a whole house renovation. And I've always listened to podcasts. I was listening, and I listened to the American Mind podcast, and Michael Anton was there, and he was interviewing a guy, Charles Haywood. And
Mm.
he has this, he mentioned his site of book reviews, The Worthy House. So I went and looked it up, thought I would read some of these reviews. It turns out that he also has audio recordings of them all. So I just put
Mm.
downloaded them, put them on hits, and went through while I was working on a full house renovation, all like 280 or something of his reviews. And that introduced me to a whole bunch of books that I started reading. And I also then had some thoughts, and Charles is gracious enough to put his email address on his website. And so I emailed him, and he was kind enough to respond. And eventually, I guess I became enough of a pest or whatever that he said, "Hey, this stuff is really good. You should publish it." So I looked into it a little bit and found Substack and started my Substack. And I thought, well, how do I promote my Substack? And I thought, well, maybe the same way that in part I do my business through social media. So I created an anonymous Twitter account, and then got on Twitter and discovered that people were talking about politics in a way that was in one part, dissident and yet conventional at the same time. And then I began thinking people are missing um, a lot of what's really going on because they're not reading Jacques Ellul. So I picked up books like Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, and I thought, well, if you've read Jacques Ellul, everything that Burnham's writing about and more is already in the technological society. So I started doing Ellul posting, and that sort of took off. And you get to be known as kind of the Ellul guy. But Ellul's analysis of technique and technology, uh, once you understand what he's saying about technique, you begin to realize it fundamentally changes the way you understand the regime. Like notions like, hey, we need to get all of the current guys out so we can put our guys in place and enact good policy. You realize that an idea like that just isn't workable once you've read Jacques Ellul, because it misunderstands the nature of the administrative state fundamentally. And once you also understand that, you realize, like, people say, well, why are businesses going woke? We thought they were our friends. Well, once you understand the kind of things that Jacques Ellul is saying, you understand that businesses, like especially businesses above a certain size, and the government are essentially the same thing. And once you understand that, you realize that churches above a certain size are also basically the same thing as the government and big business and NGOs and other nonprofits and so forth. And that's when you realize that then you can start pulling back the curtains behind, for people, and beginning to, because I've always done analysis like Marshall McLuhan's, and that with churches, the medium is the message. Like, okay, let's look at the sanctuary and how everything goes, what's happening in the sanctuary. And, what is the deeper message, regardless of any hymn that might be sung on Sunday or any sermon that might be preached? What's the message of the way that we do things? And so I've done that type of analysis because I used to be a pastor, and I switched careers, and so I still preach. And so I will bring this type of thinking and analysis to people from the pulpit and say, like, let's look around. What are we doing here? Why do we do things the way they are? And how does this influence who we are? And then once you do that same kind of analysis, that piece like the Managerial Christianity, sort of makes sense that way. So I don't know if we want to go into it deeper in terms of what, Ellul says that way, but we can do that as well.
I think that would be really fascinating to explore, because if I could like paraphrase almost what you seemed to be saying, it was almost like, and this clicked for me almost for the first time when I read your piece, it's like churches, I guess, of a certain size, and the government and other institutions are kind of running the same operating system. And I thought they were running different operating systems, so to speak.
They're not.
They're not. Yeah.
It's interesting.
So,
let me just for
so when I quote, I have it in front of me here.
There we go.
Okay, so here's the main. There's a couple of points that I think, probably three big ideas. If you want to sort of boil it down, like a 3-point sermon, right? But three big ideas, I think. One from Marshall McLuhan, and two from Jacques Ellul. So the first is that the most important part of technology is not the actual device that's in your hand, your phone, your car, the television, so forth. That really technology, and that's why he doesn't call it technique, he calls it technique, it's a way of thinking about the world. And your devices are based on that way of thinking about the world. So what it involves, and this really gets into the conscious. So, like, what's the difference between a small church and a larger church? What's the difference between using tools, and what's the difference between, an assembly line, right? What if you're making a chair with hand tools, and you have certain chair making techniques, how is that different from the chair that's made on the assembly line? And that's an important question to ask. And Ellul makes the argument that says that we as human beings have always been tool using. One is the difference in scale and also in orientation. So in the earlier version of tools, the knowledge of how to use the tool is held in memory, in community, in persons' memories, and it's taught and used organically. So when you teach somebody to do tools, you do it kind of hands-on. You learn it, you learn it culturally, kind of like an apprentice. But the decisive thing with the earlier tool use is not the tool itself, but the skill of the user. So you use a few tools that then are applied through a broad range of situations. And it's the human being using the tool that is the thing that makes the thing. And you can apply this to other tools. So you could talk about, let's say, the laws of a community. So, and this comes to this debate sort of over the Constitution, abstract ideas of rights, or the ideas of rights embedded in a particular cultural situation. So you can develop a set, this notion of rights based upon the interactions in a real living community between, say, a peasant and his lord. And there are certain obligations and responsibilities for each back and forth. Everybody kind of understands that. At a certain point in time, you can write them down. But the significant portion of these rules and how things are done are understood intuitively by the people culturally. You could say, like, too, even if you say I had something like the 10 Commandments, right? The 10 Commandments are really broad. So just like that tool that you can use in your workshop to make, 5 or 6 different things and use it differently or whatever, and it's really your skill that comes out, you can have a series of these laws or commandments that then you can apply to a broad range of situations. And really what matters is the wisdom of the person applying the law. So in contrast, then you move into the technological society. And what happens then, and this is an example that I have used in the past, is let's take, for example, a lord's estate. You've got the master of the stables. Now, he is probably a peasant, but he's risen up through the ranks. He was probably apprenticed as a stable boy. He's learned how to care for the animals on the, from the ground up. And he was deemed to be responsible. And so he's advanced kind of slowly. So the old stable master passes away, and he's now elevated by the Lord to be the new stable master. Now he's in charge. And he runs this whole thing. Now he's learned the whole organization of the the Lord's stables from the ground up, organically, with a culture, how to care for the animals, how to look for sicknesses, how to train them, all the things that have to be done in the care of the animals. He's in charge of that. So now what happens in the modern thing, you get like Taylorism, or like the McKinsey associates. They come in, right? And they will examine everything that's being done in the stables. And they then break it down, analyze it, rationalize it, turn it into an objective, or an objective, but a rationalized, objective set of policies and procedures that exist separate from the people. Okay, so you've broken down every process, every type of procedure that's in the stable. You've rationalized it, you've objectified it, and now you've got this whole plan on how to run a stable. You can then look at it and say, well, certain of these processes, we could automate this. We could put in a machine. We could automate this. We could write the code for it. And we can also now turn it into a franchise. And we can apply these same best practices to other stables to create sort of the best practices stables. So what you've done now by rationalizing this whole process is you've separated it from the person. So now what you can do then is you can take this whole analyzed situation, this report that you have, you can go back to New York, and you can now have a meeting about discussing the improving of stable operations, completely independent of the stable. You don't even necessarily have to know. You can take a college graduate from Yale or Harvard, and McKinsey can recruit them. He can pull out the policies. He can sort of say, let's go over these policies and see how we could improve stable operation. He's never been inside a barn in his life, has no idea what a barn looks like, what to be around animals is like, but yet nonetheless, he's improving how stable operations work. And this is kind of then how it works. So you've got this kind of way of thinking objective. And now what you do then is you plug it into a new situation, and you then train people into it, right? So it's not held, the knowledge is no longer held in the person, it's in the rationalized system, that then the person adapts themselves into it. And the idea is that every conceivable situation that you might encounter is now accounted for in the policy manual. And you would do this in the way that you would write code. You try to account for, if you say, I have a self-driving car, right? You would want to, you think of your self-driving car, you're taught a few basic skills, you understand the vehicle, and then you're set loose, and you're basically your own judgment. You exercise that to determine sort of what should I do in certain situations that way. Whereas before so this is this kind of idea. So Ellul says the heart of technology is this abstracting of real living sort of knowledge and culture into these policy managers. And then from there, you can begin to develop best practices, and you can unify the policies. You can tie them into, so you could tie, say, stable policies in with the blacksmith policies, and we could create efficiencies and all of these types of, and that's the sort of the mindset. And it is this way of thinking about the world that begins to take over everything. And that's sort of the one foundation piece. I don't know if you have any questions that way.
Quick interruption to let you know Philosofuture is brought to you by Objective Reality AI. Objective Reality is an alternative to products like ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, Perplexity, and Claude that doesn't have a progressive bias or agenda. Add it to your toolkit today to make sure you have access to both sides of any topic, not just what big tech wants you to see. Check it out. It's linked up in the show notes, or you can go to objectivereality.ai.
I do. So understand where you're going with that, or where he has gone with that. What do you take away, Kruptos? We're definitely at that point, right? So managerial society, and I think you might have called it bureaucratic or deep state. We call it deep state, right?
Yeah.
So the implications, I would say, on one hand, the specialization, the efficiencies, et cetera, have lifted us out of poverty, right? A good deal, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. On the other hand, desperation of the soul, right? Because we don't have that tie, that apprenticeship, I think you might say.
You're absolutely right. And this then brings us to the second major point from Ellul. So, and maybe that will help answer your question. So, Ellul argues that when you, in order to properly understand technology, you have to understand that it is neither good nor evil, right? So those are your two basic defaults. Oh, all technology is bad. We need to get rid of it all. Neither is it all good. And that, like, we need to embrace this because this is a net positive. It's always good for humanity. We also have to reject the idea that it is neutral, okay? That technology is empty and then we fill it with moral content. And depending on the moral content we fill it with, it becomes either good or evil. And so what Ellul argues instead is that technology is ambivalent. It doesn't care. So technology and technique, and so we talk about, if we think about it as a way of thinking, so this systems-based thinking that writes into policy manuals, you know, the HR department of everything, right? He argues that there's four basic axioms or rules that come with the technological ambivalence. Okay, the first is that all technical progress has a price. So, and if you read elsewhere, oftentimes the benefits of a technology are front loaded, and that's what you sell it on. Here's the problem I can solve, and here's the goods that I can bring. But oftentimes, there are always negatives or downsides that come with that technology. And he calls them like a price or a cost. And we never in any technology really truly account for the full cost of a technology as you introduce it. So there's always some price to every technical innovation. And the thing is that when you introduce it, the two come together, the goods and the ills. So you can't introduce a technique without getting both. And that's kind of what you were talking about, Richard. And then the second, he says that at each stage of technological advancement, it raises more and greater problems than it solves. So you're kind of dealing with an exponential curve. So that as you, and this is something that an author, I don't know if you're familiar with James Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Civilizations, is that as you introduce complexity, that's what Tainter talks, to solve the problems of society, what happens is that you then create new problems, and then they become more and more and more complex until the point that the system eventually breaks down. Now, Ellul talks about this. The example he uses is one of, say, your old jalopy that you've got 300,000 miles on it, been running forever. You know, you can fix it with a screwdriver and a wrench that you can keep it in behind the seat of your old pickup. In contrast, there is the technological marvel that is the Formula One car. Now, most Formula One cars, yeah, they're fast, they handle great, but how often will a Formula One car break down in the middle of a race just because the engine blows apart, because you're pressing it to its limits? Another example that we might use in this regard is, say, the difference between the older system of logistics and warehousing. So you'd have a global warehouse system, and in order to manage, sort of lumpiness in supply and delivery, you have to keep warehouses with huge amounts of supply because you never know when things might get interrupted, things might go wrong. So now with computers and satellite tracking and everything, the wizards of smart said, hey, you know what? We can squeeze all of the inefficiency out of the system and have just-in-time delivery. You don't need the warehouse. You don't need to keep any of that stuff handy, right? But the system grows more complex and also at the same time more fragile. And COVID exposed the fragility of that system. You get an introduction and now all of a sudden, oh, well, you don't have any diet pop. Oh, wait a minute. Why don't we have any diet pop on the shelf? Well, because aspartame is made in China, and during COVID, you couldn't get any aspartame. So no diet pop, or aspirin or all these other things. Oh, computer chips for your cars. That's why so they come from Taiwan. They have to be shipped over. And with the factories not working, there's no, so these types of, so this is the kind of comparisons that Lewis. So at every stage you get it raises more problems than it solves. And so oftentimes we try to solve one set of technical problems with another technology, right? So and then at each stage you create more problems. So then the third threat is that the harmful effects of technology are inseparable from its beneficial effects. In other words, it doesn't matter. When you introduce them, you will get both the goods and the ills. So yeah, you will be able to create great prosperity, but you might also then the side benefits. It might, like you say, like a completely soulless society. And then fourth, as much as you might try to predict the effects, there is always a great number of unforeseen effects. So he says the combination of these things, and he says there's a kind of unreason to it all, that it's almost like a treadmill where we're constantly trying to solve the old technological problems with new technological solutions, and society gets more and more complex, more and more fragile. The problems continue to mount, and eventually, like James Tainter notes, the social inputs that go into the society eventually outstrip the outputs, and at a certain point in time, you're no longer extracting enough goods to keep the system going, and eventually kind of collapses. And so this is why also, too, you're never going to arrive at technological nirvana. Like the utopian dream that we can manage our way out of all of humanity's problems is inherently false, because every technique that you introduce to, say, solve poverty, remove inequality, all of these types of these problems that we face socially, anytime you introduce a technique, an organization, a government ministry with a set of plans, policies, and procedures, the ills that result will come with the goods so you're going to achieve some goods, but you're always going to get new ills. And if you try to then fix and fiddle with the ills will continue to mount up, and you never get to that point where you've eliminated all the ills, because every new fix that you enter adds more ills to the system, and you never arrive at utopia, like the technical utopia. And that's
a quick question. So, in this way of thinking, and I've argued for that for a long time, there's always two sides to the equation, and people only look at one. Whichever side you're arguing from, they only look at one side. So, technological innovation comes with benefits, materialistic benefits, typically, is what I'd say, and I think probably most of the ills come from spiritual cost.
Yes, social, spiritual, interpersonal.
Right? And so
because the technical system is really working. I mean, the point of it is to make things more efficient and to create consistent outcomes, right? Because when things are based upon the talent of human beings, it's very dependent upon the culture, the persons. It's very lumpy. So one of the reasons why the technical system appeals is you can generally squeeze a lot of the lumpiness out of the system. So you use teaching methods to create a baseline of educational outcomes, right? That's one example. But you're also looking to create quality control. So you can squeeze a thing, and you're looking to create more efficiency. And so what the technical system allows you to do is to harness resources and people at scale in a way that is efficient and predictable. Right? And that's really why its appeal. That's what makes the global world possible, is this use of technique to harness people towards efficiency, consistent outcomes. It's basically about power and money. And that's
maybe,
really,
maybe,
yeah. And it's
maybe
really
I'm
what
jumping to
allows
the
the world
last.
to run at scale.
Maybe I'm jumping to the last chapter here, but the question I immediately have is accepting the premise, and I think I do, and I think Chris and I have talked about this a lot. I straddle two worlds of a neo-Catholic Amish community future
Yeah.
with I'm actually an AI entrepreneur, so I straddle both these worlds, and the question I have then, in that way of thinking, does the future can you accept and embrace technological innovation and change while addressing the cost, which aren't really associated with the materialistic aspects of it? Can you hit this nirvana where the technology is there and used in positive, constructive ways, but the costs, which are typically social, spiritual, are addressed for what they are, spiritual poverty, right? Can you have both of those at the same time?
Yeah, and I think that's the right question. That so far, from an experiential point of view, the answer would be no. But one of the things that Elul points out in the technological society is that the Greeks as a culture rejected pushing technique too far, and largely because they saw that it would undermine human excellence. And that as a cultural item, their quest for human excellence. They looked at it and said, if we make machines in that sense, then it will undermine our own quest for personal excellence. So the real question is, and this is the big one, and this is what I've talked about with people, is the question of sort of time and moral restraint. So this comes down to an idea of Nick Land of acceleration and breaking out, what's the word that he uses? Like capital acceleration. And so, but you can also have technical acceleration where it breaks beyond the ability, the containment point, and it becomes its own justification, right? So
We're there.
Technology in that sense needs to be contained within a cultural setting that says, we could do this, but doing so would be inhuman. Now,
now, can I ask real quick back? So,
yeah,
applications today, but Greek. Do you have like some examples in Greek culture where they put the brakes on?
No, and it's largely it's like a 2 or 3 page section in Elul, and it makes sense. I think it was not so much that they had a technology that they rejected. It's just, I think it was more that they didn't pursue it because they were pursuing excellence instead.
Mindset.
Yeah.
Can I say, I think Richard and I have this conversation. It recurs a lot. And one of the things we keep coming back to is you have thinkers like Steven Pinker who are of the opinion that humans are basically just good. And then you have the spiritual side of things where if we're Christian, we're saying, well, there's a fallen nature. And it always seems to come back to how you are going to approach things. Because the question of, well, can we make it work? We're coming from, well, there's a fall, like a fallen nature. But it seems like the outside world, the world that wants to flatten everything, homogenize it, get rid of any distinguishing capability. So that the essential thing that it gets drowned out is anything that you're talking about, like with humanity, everything needs to be the same. So it's interoperable, so you can squeeze out the efficiencies, so you have those two mindsets at odds. And as long as they're at odds, I don't know what that means for actual technical use.
Well, it's huge.
Yeah, it's no, I did miss some of that, but there is that fundamental, if you believe in the basic goodness of humanity or the goodness of the world, and that sense that human beings will emerge into a nirvana if we can just engineer the externals that will allow people then to flourish. I mean, that's the basic belief of modernity, that if we get all of the externals right and we can engineer all of the systems of society correctly, then people will just simply be the good people that they are born to be.
Right.
And from a religious perspective, that people are born flawed, sinful, however you conceive of the notion of original sin. And it's hard not to look around and see that, I think that this idea that we're born a blank slate or good is naively optimistic, and that there is a fundamental, like Carl Schmitt called it, a dangerousness in human beings, that there is this sense that that the people are flawed, and as a result, and the world has flaws in it, and I think technology can't escape this reality that we live in a fallen world, and a world in which evil exists, and so it gets bound into this whole the dynamic of the world that we're in, that technology itself cannot escape the evil that the world is in, and so as a result, even when it tries to manifest good, it also manifests what's evil at the same time, right? And that's and I guess it comes back to that question. This is something that Ellul talks about, and I've come to term what we call the tank problem, and this is the challenge that you face. So, from a political perspective and a social perspective, you may not have an option in terms of dealing with technology, because if you as a society think we're going to go full Amish, and we're going to get rid of all modern technology, and we're going to only have things that maximize human skill and so forth, we're going to go back to, and your neighbor, and you've done this as a nation, and you've said, this is a good thing. But what happens if the nation next to you goes like, oh my word, right? We can build tanks and assembly lines, and none of those guys across the border are building tanks and assembly lines, and we could conquer them just like that. Right. And so you have to figure out a way, if you want to be that Amish community, to deal with your neighbor's tanks. Now, you may not have to make tanks, but you got to figure out how to deal with the tank problem. And this is really the situation that we're in. And part of, and maybe this is the doomer in me a little bit, but part of me thinks that it may end up coming down to externals finally forcing us to grapple with the limits of technology, that we either run out of energy, the social catastrophe comes to a point where people just say we can't live like this anymore, and eventually they say we have to impose some limits to the technique and technology, because really what is required, and this is the way that the older world worked, is that if you introduced a tool, or say like something like a law, and it doesn't work, and you figure out this isn't really this way of doing things doesn't suit us as a people. So you modify it and you do this, but you do it over time, right? And this is the one thing that the technological system doesn't give you, is this time to adapt technology, technique into your social context, have it become part of your social memory, and to have it subordinated to the social demands, faith, religion, morality. This is the way we do things around here. It doesn't give you that time to integrate it into those systems. So this is like when you talk about the Bruderhof community, and they do this rather intentionally. They say it's not that we don't use technology, but if we introduce a technology into our religious community, which we do sometimes, we have to answer the question of, overall, is this going to be a net benefit for everybody in the community? Is everybody in the community going to be able to adapt to this, embrace it, or is this going to, like, if we bring in this machine to make our furniture making more efficient, is this going to eliminate meaningful work for one member of our community, or a handful of members of our community? And if you think to yourself, and they said, if we can come to a sense as a community and say that, no, this is not going to negatively impact us as a community, but it really is going to help us as a whole in our work. And yes, it's going to make it more efficient. We as a community can absorb this technology. Now, there's others that we're going to reject, but this one we feel like we can integrate into our community and absorb it over time and make it part of who we are. And I think that answers your question somewhat, Richard. Yeah, but it's a question of like, this is something that we're not really doing in the modern world that way right now.
So what I propose, Chris and I have talked about this a lot, the acceleration. So I've been involved with AI and similar technologies for a long time, and I'm watching this knee in the curve of exponential acceleration. And I really do believe it's going to push, not everyone, obviously, but push a lot of people into this decision-making framework of, wow, am I going to take the chip in the brain? Am I going to have a robotic social companion? I think people are going to start to have to draw lines that really, I mean, it sounds like you know of more examples, but for me, Amish were the only people drawing those lines somewhere.
right.
They drew it at 1900. We might have to draw it at 2020. Someone else might draw it at 2027.
Unless the
Well,
decision's made for people, made on a society level, which is not cool.
well, that's
Like
right.
that
It
happened
may
with
be that
AI
just simply we
already.
run out of resources.
Yeah.
Like what
Yeah.
happens when you run out of rare earth metals? Well, good luck with cell phone technology.
Yeah. So my thought there is we only need humans. We only need so many basically watts of energy input, right?
Yeah.
And if we get 1,000, using a Musk analogy, we get 1,000 watts per square meter falling on the earth, and we're able to convert that at 20 or 30% efficiency, whatever it is. I think the technological advancements going to hit us harder, faster than any constraints on resources or energy. Like, I think we're almost there, right? Where people are taking chips in the brain. They're doing patient 2 at Neuralink, and AI social companions are happening. We're there. If not today, definitely in the next 24, 36 months. And it's going to have pretty broad implications. So what I'm wondering about from your perspective is what is that end game in your mind? If you were king for a day, what is your ultimate structured society?
Whew.
Are you?
Yeah.
It sounds like you might go full feudal, full medieval feudal system.
The problem with a medieval feudal system is it's based on a set of religious beliefs that are no longer operative for most people, right? And that's the challenge that way. For me, I think the biggest thing would be unplugging the scale of the world, right? And this is there really is. As soon as you try to impose a unified solution everywhere, you end up needing technique, and this is part of the problem. Is that really the solution, quote unquote, isn't, I think, going to really happen until the modern order begins to break up. So in that regard, really, accelerationists like Nick Land are correct, is that in a sense, the only way out is through. And there is no going back, really.
Yeah.
But once we're through on the other side, it's like taking a bite of the apple in the garden. You now have the knowledge, right? And so everybody knows about technology. It's not like you can put the genie back in the bottle, because now people know what kind of power they can wield. So they will continue to try to wield that power, but they won't be able to do it at the scale that they did before for various reasons. It might be energy depletion. It might be resource depletion. But we're reaching those points that you can see, even as the technology accelerates with AI and so forth, that at the same time as the technology accelerates, you're also accelerating towards the inevitable collapse, I believe.
So how does your thinking map on? You mentioned Charles Haywood, or Hayworth, sorry. And he's got this foundationalist model where space and expansion out into space is like a vital part of the future that we need.
We need the new pilgrims is what we need.
So you have two basic groups of those who are opposed to the liberal left regime, right? So, and Charles breaks it down into sort of the wizard and the prophets. I think I'm trying to remember the name of the book that's from. That generally, so far in the West, the wizards have been winning, right? So the wizards have come up with solutions to push through the Malthusian crisis, the Malthusian trap of resource scarcity, and have found ways to win thus far. And there are those of us who are on the prophet side who are like doomers and say, like, okay, that's fine for now, but sooner or later, we live in a finite universe. that we can. So there's this sense of pushing down. This is, even though Charles and I both agree on this, we have, we've emailed back and forth. We have a friendly disagreement on this. And he's a techno optimist, and I'm a techno pessimist. And that I keep trying to trying to draw him in and say, like, Charles, you and I do have to have a conversation about this on a podcast or something, because but he keeps saying to me, I got to write that piece or put my thoughts into words, so that way, I come ready to go, otherwise he'll get demolished or whatever, you know what I mean? But I like, that's, so we have had that disagreement. It's respectful, and it's like, I get it. Like, the techno optimist position isn't idiotic. I just think ultimately in the end, when you look at the nature of technique, it eventually, and I think the idea that it runs up into certain finite limits are, I think, just that to me seems the more natural way, or the more obvious route, to say that you can push something for so long and eventually, and the rise and fall of empires in history, I think, bears that out, that you can push things for so long and then eventually the wheels come off because you've reached the limits of how far you can push. And we're coming pretty close to that now. Like, we've got maybe 100, 150 years at most before it, and maybe not even that much before it's done,
Chris and I have this discussion a lot. Chris is a strong limits guy. I waffle between techno optimism. I think the thing about it is there's no question, like you said, it's happening. We're going to go through it. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. There's no government restraint that's going to handle it. But again, I come back to, I don't know. I think you used the word ambivalent. Technology is ambivalent. It's the fallen nature of man that creates the problem. It's the spiritual desolation that, having more isn't going to make you feel better, right? That's not the C.S. Lewis a hole in the soul, right? So I think this is why I waffle. I haven't fully landed. I have this vision. We have this large tract of land that would suit well for I'm Catholic, by the way, so speaking of the Managerial Church, we can talk about that some point. But I call it the Neo-Amish Catholic community. So I waffle between this, technologically stunted or halted world. Like you said, you just have to you have to rely on the benevolence of your neighbors, like we do with the Amish. We just, hopefully everybody else is doing their own thing enough, they leave us alone. Versus,
that's kind of what the Amish are hoping.
Yeah, that's what they're hoping. Versus the, Star Trek utopia where technology is there, basically, abundance, Diamante's abundance, and more of us are freed to understand the missing component, which has happened to me, actually. I think that's my path. I was raised Protestant, spent most of my life as a deist or atheist or agnostic, depends on the moment. And in searching for the truth, while searching for technological optimism, I landed back home, I guess I'll say. But I wonder if it's possible that a fraction of society will come to the point, technology is there, it's useful, you choose what to use, but it's not technology's fault, it's our fault. And we have to recognize that and find out what we're missing.
Well, that's something that I have come back to as well through, and that the solution to technology is not within the system, the technical system itself. And this is the one thing that Ellul notes, and I think this comes back to also, it's a point that Heidegger makes, that technology enframes us, right? So if you look around at the world, what you discover once you understand the technique, that the most important thing is of technology is the way of thinking, is that everywhere you go, there is only one answer. It's a technical solution to every problem. And there are different technical solutions, but they are all technical solutions. And so if in a sense, if you're going to cut the Gordian knot, so to speak, the quote unquote solution, if but even saying a solution is still thinking as a technological, right? But whatever the answer is lies outside of the technological society as we conceive it nowadays. So I've argued from a Protestant perspective that one of the, again, for, you think of like the goods and ills come together, right? We're in a sinful world. So Protestantism brought a number of goods, but it also brought a few ills. One was rationalizing the faith. And as it rationalized it, it objectified the faith, and it diminished, this comes back to the Ian McGilchrist, the brain sense. My sense of it is that it diminished our ability to apprehend God directly, the rationalization that Protestantism has brought, especially Western Christianity that way. And in North America, we've tended to deal with it. You've heard this before, the head-heart split, right? So what we need to do is we need to tie our head to our heart. But what that does is it emotionalizes the faith, and then it makes you vulnerable to the kind of moral relativism of, well, if it feels right, I do it because I'm now. So the solution is not head and heart, but rather the one thing that we jettisoned as Protestants, which was the mystical pursuit of God, and also with it the monasteries, in sense the what do you call it, Christian, like the heroic Christian journey, in a sense of the pursuit of God. And so it's the kind of thing that not everybody will be able to do fully, but people can do it in part. But we don't have examples of the heroic man of God who abandons everything to pursue mystical union with God himself, in a way that most of us, because, as Paul talks about in Corinthians, because our interests are divided. We have a wife, we have kids, we have a business. And as much as we might want to have that full mystical union with God, as much as I might want to spend, an hour or 2 hours of prayer a day, I run a business, I have family, I have kids, I have obligations. And as much as my heart might tug me in that regard, it just becomes very difficult to do that. Even when I, like, as a thinking person, know that this is the solution, is to step outside of the frame and to re-immerse myself in the presence of God, in that mystical presence of God. The challenge of doing it in the technical world, in the busyness of sort of a bourgeois life, you know what I mean? In that regard. So
yeah, this is awesome. There's so much I want to ping you about. I'm going to segue us a little bit. And so I know that you've said Christians should be political. And then I also know you had, I really want to dig into this. You said conservatism is not a thing in the USA. So I know a lot of Christians who are like, I'm hands off. God's going to handle everything. I'm not going to get political. And I think, like, a lot of people are like me. I was kind of steeped in liberalism while thinking I was conservative until just a few years ago. And I've been on this journey out of it as I've realized more about that. But can you dig into that thought of, if you're a Christian and a conservative, can you just kind of synthesize those two things there?
Yeah, that's a big one. And I wrote that piece, and I might almost even just pull it back up again briefly, just because it's one of those things where we generally tend to think about we think of liberalism and conservatism within the frame that we have been given. So the truly conservative world would have been the one, might even be, say, prior to the Reformation, but at least prior to industrialization. So this, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Peter Laslitt's The World That We Lost, and he spends the whole book basically detailing, as best as he could from records, like actual historical records, what did the world look like before industrialization? How did people organize their families? What were the social groupings like? The various strata in society? How was it broken down? Even like boring stuff like when we're girls getting married, we have this thing that like, oh, girls in the 1700s all got married when they were 12. No, they didn't. The average age of getting married was 22. For one thing, they had their nutrition wasn't as good. Most of them didn't even actually begin puberty until they were 16 or 17 anyways, because of nutritional reasons. They don't eat as well as we did. And actually, if there was a group that married younger, it was elites. Right. So, but there is a whole series of things where there is an integrated life. Think of, and this is one of the things that Tolkien did. You ask yourself, why did Tolkien spend like the first 200 pages of a book talking about the Shire? And why do the hobbits always reference life back to the Shire, in contrast to Mordor and the Twin Towers, and in part because this was Tolkien's way of saying that, we live in a sinful world. I mean, being a Catholic, evil's out there, but this is the Shire is kind of the best that we can do. And so the Shire looks a lot like that world of 1700s England. And so there is this sense that, most people who think of themselves as conservatives are defending the liberal order that broke down that older world of the Shire. Families organized around households, the basic economic unit centered around the household, and like either the farm or the shop or the small business. And it mechanized everything, industrialized everything. And then when the social system fell apart, you needed, of course, the government to step in with schooling, with healthcare, with feeding people, all of these types of things to pick up the pieces and this is not to say that it was a utopia, but it's just the what happened when we talk about conservatism today. We're talking about going back to
1950,
the way, the system of things that broke down the old way of doing things.
I agree.
And then re-embracing.
I agree. We conservatives today are looking for the 1950s, not the 1600s. I have a large contingency of people I know, not a large, but some, who are actually promote the, let's get back to the point where the highest percentage of people were saved, which is probably, feudal Europe circa 1400, something like that. And if your metric is on human flourishing, is, joining God in heaven, then that arguably is the best answer, right?
Yeah, where you have like 150 feast days a year, and your life really revolves around a sacral calendar. I mean, even the Protestants began to look at like we can't have all these feast days. It's not efficient. Like, how can you run a business when everybody's taking work off for a third of the year? It doesn't work that way, right?
The question is, can you have the benefits? We have this equation, the cost and the benefit of technology. Can you have both worlds? Can you understand that there is a cost, a social, spiritual cost to technology, realize that, and still use technology? I mean, you mentioned a community. What was the name of it that's tries to do this?
Bruderhof. I think
Bruderhof. Give us a little overview for people who don't know about that, like me.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing. I think that yes, in theory, it is possible, right? So, but it's a matter of, religious, social, and moral mastery, right? The challenge that you will face in a sinful world is that there's, even if, let's say, 99.9% of the people all come together and we have this kumbaya moment, and we're going to now subordinate technology and put it in its rightful place, and we're going to learn to be at peace with both its costs and benefits, and find the technologies where we can accept the costs, gain the benefits, and we can live at peace in what we call a world of trade-offs, which is how the medieval world worked. They understood they weren't seeking a utopia. I mean, Christ was going to return, and that was when utopia was to start. So in the world today, we have a series of trade-offs, and we're going to try to do the best we can given the environment that we have, that kind of medieval mindset. The problem is with technology is once this knowledge is out, there's always going to be that one guy saying like, why are none of these people using this technology to harness human resources and capital? They could make a lot of money and dominate the world. So you're always going to, I think, it may be, I don't know really what the solution, and it might be just, and this is why I've said it might be just simply circumstances that force itself upon us. In theory, I can conceive of the world. I just know that right how we live right now, I don't see it happening, except for, and except for maybe, and this is why I've advocated this regard, is sort of what you would call dissident parallel communities. So communities that gather together to grapple with technology, but not in a naive way, where they come together and realize that we want to forge a new relationship to technology. We want to enhance people's excellence and ability, that should be our primary, is human flourishing, not the flourishing of technique or machines. But yet at the same time, we have to be aware, like Joe Biden says, he's got F-16s, right? And so we have to be able to, in order to establish sovereignty in our own community, we have to, that's really the two bases of sovereignty are, you have to get the outsider to recognize your sovereignty, and you have to have the support of the people. Beyond that, everything else is meaningless. And so the way you establish your sovereignty is to defend yourself from attackers. That's that sort of Schmittian friend-enemy distinction. So you as friends have to defend yourself from your enemies and get your enemies to recognize that you have a right to exist. And once they've recognized your right to exist, then you have a certain measure of liberty. Let's not use the word freedom because it comes with a lot of you have a certain liberty to live life the way that you choose. But these alternate parallel communities, the regime's not going to like this, the current global regime, because they want to exercise the managerial authority over everything, of the HR department of all things.
Good one.
And so, you have to come to grips with the fact that you have to deal with the regime's tank problem, and that you have to be able to defend yourself. You can't. If you are serious about it, the Amish solution won't matter, because if the Amish ever become a threat, the regime will squash them like bugs. And that's just the way it worked, right? So that's the unfortunate thing. So this is kind of the problem that you're in.
The threat, I don't even think they have to become a threat. They only have to be another avenue toward resources, right? Right?
That could be right, true. That's right, exactly.
It's almost like an impossibility, because in order to protect yourself from external threats who are utilizing technology to its fullest, means you have to probably have production capability to be able to use and embrace that technology in that way. I'm not going to use it in brain implants, but You know what? They will be using it in brain implants, and they will be controlling humanoid robots and whatever that is. We don't need to go dystopic, but it almost, that doomer, this is that bridge I straddle. It almost feels like you have to have, again, maybe like the Pilgrims, you have to almost have a physical separation between these communities. And, in Catholicism, maybe Protestants do it too. I'm new to the whole thing, but we call it near occasion of sin. Right? So try to rid yourself of near occasion of sin, and technology is just increasing that occasion. So if food is so abundant that I can be gluttonous, there it is, right? If pornography is now 5 taps of the keyboard away, well, there it is. So it's almost like you also need a physical separation from those who may want your resources or want power and take over, as well as that separation from that quote unquote near occasion of sin.
There is, I think, and this is a sense why, in a sense, democracy is always a bad idea, in a sense, because it politicizes everything, right? So you almost need a sense of inside and outside. And this is something I think N.S. Lyons has talked about, but it's this idea that, as you establish space for yourself, and this is, my recent pieces on Walter Ong have been about this masculine need to create space. So as you create space for your community, one of the functions of the leadership, and this is that sort of political dimension of politics requires you to do hard things, right? So there may be a segment of your society that then has to deal with weapons, guns, and certain types of technology, and take the risks of that for the benefit of others, then who, by doing so, you can create the space for them to live in a way that doesn't necessitate them having to deal with politics all the time, but also not necessarily having to deal with this type of weapon. And you do it on their behalf because you have a shared we. And you make a sacrifice that then imperils your soul. And this is sort of the fundamental nature of politics, because you're dealing with power, right? So you take the ring, like Boromir, and you wield the ring, recognizing that in doing so, then that's the nature of the story, right? Even Frodo carrying the ring to the mountain ultimately couldn't let go of it, right? It took the accident, the divine accident of Gollum's greed for the ring to finally destroy it, right? But that was that,
well, one could argue we're doing that now with our military, right? We're training them to be killers and equipping them, and they're taking that.
That's kind of what we hope, right? Yeah, but but like we could look at it this way too as well, that the Russia-Ukraine war has also been an interesting lesson on technology. Like, as you know, as like a tech guy too, you have the cutting edge of technology, like the very cutting edge. And it used to be like, as I'm old enough to remember when computers first came out, right? If you wanted to do anything, you had to have a cutting edge computer in your house. You had to be buying the latest machine like every 18 months just to keep up. Nowadays, I don't have to have a cutting edge computer to do what I need to do. Most of it, I could buy a cutting edge computer. I could spend 20 grand on a laptop or a desktop that would do, sing, dance, and do whatever for me, but I don't need that. Although I am discovering that my video processing capabilities could be upgraded, but that's, but you get into the Russia-Ukraine war, and Americans are bringing Javelin missiles at like how many millions a piece, right? And we've discovered now that being in a tank or being a foot soldier is very, very dangerous in a world of $5,000 drones.
Yeah.
And, so there is a sense where, we talk about the tank problem. Is the solution necessary to have assembly lines with tanks rolling off them? Or is there perhaps a more humane solution? We talked about that, something that exercises the humanity of people. Is there a more humane solution? Maybe it's drones, maybe it's not. Probably isn't drones, because drones are going to come with benefits and evils as well too, right? But is there a solution that allows you to deal with the tank problem and not have to give up your soul in order to do so? So I don't know necessarily, or is it like, maybe not give, but is there a technology that we can then morally subordinate easier than the assembly line and the tank, right? And in some of those questions. So maybe there is technologies that we can integrate better into the social and religious and subordinate them to our moral religious society easier than the kind of, the necessary production line from raw materials through to the tank, that integrated supply chain that's required to produce tanks. Maybe we can dispense with that integrated supply chain and have something that's smaller, more nimble, but just something that's more humane. So in theory, you'd like to think that, yeah, it's possible. And maybe that's the route where the wizards finally have the last laugh again and say, we can bring it back. I still remain somewhat skeptical. I think ultimately ends up being a problem in a sinful world of trade-offs, that you get goods, but you have to accept ills, and you have to then make the moral question of what ills are we willing to accept? Do we understand the ills well enough to say that we can integrate them into our community and grapple with them and still have a fair degree of human flourishing? I think those are kind of those are the questions. Like, I'm not sure I have answers, but I think those are more the questions that we need to be asking.
Well, how much, to what extent do you think that you adopt technology, whether you're a person or a country, let's say, even on the state level, how much does that make you more vulnerable? You think it increases your capabilities, but I'll take, for example, in an asymmetric way. North Korea, they're not as online as a nation as America. We adopted all this technology, but now we're really vulnerable to hacking, which doesn't cost a whole lot. And I wonder if something similar, there might be some sort of analogy on the personal level, even if you really get into transhumanist stuff, maybe naturally you're just going to be, ironically less capable, more vulnerable than the person who doesn't.
Can we dig into that? You brought up North Korea. So I'm thinking about this parallel communities, because this is something I've toyed with for a long time. And the question is, how are you left alone? North Korea has pretty much been left alone, right? So they don't have a lot of technology. They have very little. They're eating tree bark. They're poor, things, whatever that. But put that aside, we've left them alone because it's not worth the effort, right? I mean, subjugating them doesn't really help the rest of the world too much. I mean, any feedback there? Why do we leave North Korea alone? Are they enough of a military threat to us doing so? I mean,
it's a sense of cost-benefit analysis of North Korea, right? Is there, and that is really, we've had a unipower, like a unipolar world in which, the United States has been the 600-pound gorilla that has been largely able to impose its will everywhere. But we are coming into a much more unipolar world. Now, in this kind of situation, a North Korea might actually be more dangerous because they're not contained in the same way they were by a dominant American hegemony. And so, I think we are already beginning to see, and this is something that James Burnham talked about, with the death of liberal. I forget the title of the book, but he says you can track the expansion of the liberal world and now its gradual retreat. And he says you can do so with metrics even. And you can track. And so he wrote this book back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. You could already see the retreat of the liberal world order. And we're seeing it more and more every day where societies are pushing back on, what was it this morning? I was in the news. Chad has basically overthrown the government, I think, and they are now moving from an American protectorate to a Russian protectorate. And so they're still not strong enough to stand on their own and to keep their resources for themselves, but now they're falling into the orbit of Russian influence. So it is this question of what would it take, like another interesting example. And I think the United States is probably a lot closer. I don't know if you're ever going to see the breakup of the United States, and maybe we will. But you think of that situation with Greg Abbott on the Texas border, as a political solution, organizing locally, and then, basically saying, well, we dare you to come down and stop us.
Yeah.
And they basically said, nah, whatever, we won't bother. And now it didn't in the end mean a whole lot other than the symbolics of, wait a minute, you could do this elsewhere and ramp this up as a political program. Now, at a certain point in time, you probably will get actual real opposition. But by that time, maybe you're dug in. There is a South African gentleman, Ernst van Zyl. And as South Africa has broken down, the Afrikaner community, he said one of the things that had happened is that they had given over large degrees of their sovereignty over to the larger state because they saw it as friendly. And then when it stopped being friendly, they had to ask very hard questions. And they said, well, we can no longer count on them to do these tasks well. That's the first thing. So let's start reclaiming sovereignty for ourselves. And so they began to organize. So now you have a group like AfriForum that helps establish Afrikaner sovereignty within the functioning state, or semi-functioning state of South Africa. And so they've begun to do schools, universities. There's a whole range of things where they even some policing functions and protection functions. And so there are avenues that way to follow, I think, similar types of models of just reclaiming sovereignty for yourself. Like, don't rely on the government to educate your kids.
Mhm.
These types of things. Have your own schools. Find your own ways to supply your own food resources, that you're not dependent upon the large, big ag for your food supply. And then, can you secure energy sources that, if push comes to a shove, they can't cut you off and turn the lights off on you, these types of things. So it becomes in a sense of like, what areas can you reclaim sovereignty for yourself on a local level? And then when you're doing that, can you begin to do so in a way that is not just sort of re-upping the old technological order, but on a smaller scale? But are you actually then being mindful of, conscious of, can we then do this in a way that subordinates technique to the human, spiritual, moral, social demands of the human person and community?
So I might argue that we are partially doing that today. And
I think it's already happening.
There's one on the pro side of technology. There's one pro is, I think, social media, what we're doing right now, has lended itself to this formation of communities, this recognition that we aren't alone. I'm homeschooling my kids. I'm trying to reclaim sovereignty. I'm trying to keep a moral, spiritual value system apart from the physical society that I'm in. And that's lonely until you find community that is like-minded. And I think this is a good example of technology is allowing this.
Yes, that's right. It has, like, okay, so like we take example like social media and so forth, and some of these technology, we recognize on the one hand that Zoom calls and these social media and so forth, that they do, and they can have a corrosive effect on and they undermine community to some extent.
Right.
But a lot of that undermining factor had already happened prior to the advent of Zoom calls and social media. Anyways, we're pretty much deracinated now as it is. But whereas, like, okay, so on the left, they had a whole series of political organizations that they've been organizing, taking over the institutions, blah, 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 largely because the institutions were basically designed to be progressive anyways. That's the one point that we sort of skated over a little bit. But they took that sort of long march through the institutions, and because there's a sort of a reality of those networks of power and people or whatever, social media and Twitter, and especially Twitter, just adds a bit of jet fuel to that. We, on the other side, coming at this from the other side, having had our communities undermined and largely destroyed, are now trying to build something back from the other end, beginning with social media, networking, whatever, to try to translate that into real communities. This is one of the reasons why I've made the argument that I believe that, in part because the state apparatus, this technical system, operates like a divine being, and that really, and it sort of gives you power for your crops, so to speak, right? So there's a transaction there that the old divinities used to have. And so we trade that with the whole technical system, the state, in government, business, whatever. We trade it becomes the sort of the when we talked about in framing, but it's within which we live and move and have our being, as Paul says, right? So this is the way that the technical system operates. And so really you have a clash of gods almost. And so if you look in society to where are there still living social networks that haven't been completely obliterated? And that's largely in the churches. And then if you realize and sort of frame up that, this battle is largely one of a clash of gods, you realize, well, in the West, and that's really where this is all originated, the gods that are clashing are the techno-economic system and, the God of the scriptures, right? And so I think that this is going to come to a head, and there can be only one. So either the techno system will completely subordinate the church and the Christian faith to its demands, or you can push back, and in that sense you have to, I guess, quote unquote, defeat it in some sense. But the networks that exist there in the church communities are real, and the tools that we have in social media and digital communication allow us to network and to what's the right word? To network that power and that we have in our networks of communities, and then accelerate that as well, I think, and just sort of, and that's one. So that's, you might say, a good that comes of this technology. Now, I think there are certain ills that come. I mean, social media right away, it takes you out of the people that are right at hand into people that are across the globe, and that always undermines the building of actual community. So there is a sense of as much as we use this stuff now, we are going to have to come to a reckoning where we find a way to keep it in tension and maintain or limit its ability to undermine real relationships that are flesh and blood and right at hand.
Right.
And I'm just sort of
And
talking,
the more that's
here.
undermined, the less you talk to your neighbor, because you do have differences, the less
That's right.
influence you have on each other, right? So maybe one,
and the less you're able to resist the regime.
yeah. So maybe one person on that side of the transaction is a God-fearing, old conservative, and if we just walk away and form parallel communities, then that's even worse potentially. It's like, save yourself or and your family, or try and help save everyone.
Well, that's right. And it comes down to, in a sense, of recognizing that you are part of that there doesn't have to be necessarily one solution. There's no right way to do this, but you also have to recognize that you need to be part of a network of allied communities with a common enemy. That we may not all establish sovereignty or reestablish sovereignty in the same way, but we have to recognize that there might be 20, 50, 10, whatever number the groups are, that are all struggling to do the same thing, and that by allying, we may, when the dust settles, we may not all be friends. We might have, we might end up running into tensions and conflicts with each other. But for now, we share a common enemy, and it behooves us to work together.
Well, so
yeah.
So to what extent, I think a lot of what we're talking about has to do with this conversation around like globalism, and I've heard that you've mentioned. You talked a little bit about the devaluation of citizenship. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, okay. So we have to understand that when you look at what is natural for human connections, that human society is built around family, clan, tribe, village. And so it's a meaningful scale of life is probably like, how far can you walk or ride a horse in a day and back? That's probably the scale with which human beings want to operate, So maybe you can go out and walk for a week or so into the bigger town or whatever to do business occasionally. But by and large, human life is built around villages. And for most of history, that's kind of the way that life was built. And this idea that you become part of, because you share a broader ethnicity or language, that you are part of this thing called a nation, is itself already part of the modern technical, in a sense, deracinated world. Because what you have to do is you have to say to somebody, your primary allegiance is no longer to your village or your valley, but your allegiance is to this concept, this idea of the nation, that, okay, we all share a same language, we all have roughly the same, and this is this, so we become a collection of villages. But in order to become the nation, you have to give up, in some sense, your primary identity as belonging to this valley or this village or these series of clans. And so already the nation is a construct of propaganda that undermines the more human scale and level of life. And so we have to understand that citizenship in the nation is already a sign that you're becoming that you're moving from a sort of a human relationship to one of being a cog in a larger project that is technical and managerial at its heart. So because in order to scale up to the level of the nation, it requires technique to run it efficiently and so forth. And, if you trace back the rise of the nation state, I mean, it was already beginning at the end of the middle, the high Middle Ages in the 1400s. And then you move forward from there. Before even you arrive at things like democratic or nationalism in the 1700s, that these types of transformations were already beginning to, the centralization around the crown. So you think of like Louis XIV and these sort of things were already signs of rising technique and its application in, greater centralization, greater control. That was largely how the lords were undermined, is that they were able to, the crown was able to harness resources at a national thing and money at a national level in order to undermine the power of the more regional lords that way. So there was all of this process that you get there. So in that sense, yeah, nation is, and that's why for me, like when people talk about Christian nationalism, as much as I am of the mind that Christians need to be politically self-conscious in the coming era, and that they can no longer count on the state to maintain their ability to be a separate people, like a religious community, the people of God, that they have to take their own sovereignty into their own hands, that, just the term nationalism draws us back to that sort of 1800, 1900s idea of the artificial nation state. And we become attached to the nation state largely because the village and the local community was undermined. And then when they moved to the global system, now all of a sudden that we've become attached to our nation, now that's a bad thing too. It's the nation has become the new village, but it's really largely a construct of propaganda.
Yeah.
And technique.
So I know the term doomers come up a couple times. Do you have any sense of optimism, given where things are at right now? Often Richard and I end the podcast and we're like, well, that was kind of depressing, like where do you see some opportunity to be optimistic?
Well, I think the one thing that I am being optimistic about is that I look around at the people that are closest to me as fellow believers and friends, and people that I would not have thought of it, 4 or 5 years ago, are having conversations that I thought like, oh, that's interesting that you're talking like that now. So I think that there is a growing awareness among people that something needs to give and things need to change. And I think people are slowly starting to wake up for the idea, especially Christians.
Do we have any metrics on that?
We are becoming that there's a target on our back. Let's say like we're not in, and people are sort of, well, what do we need to do about this fact that we have a target on our back? And
do we have any metrics on this growing awareness? Because I think that's really important. In my mind, that's like a kernel of hope.
Yeah.
Do we have a way to measure that?
I'm not so sure. There was an interesting article in First Things by N.S. Lyons about the growing, I think it was on like early May, and he talked about the dark enchantment, but that there is a growing religiosity in society. Now, some of it is moving in what we call a pagan manner, but I think there's a greater recognition for people that the problem isn't going to be solved with politics. So he did have some charts and numbers, but I think we've reached sort of the low of secularization, that the number of nuns, as we say, has flatlined. And so let me
give you guys a kernel of hope that I've come to embrace. So I have dabbled. I married a Catholic. I've dabbled with Catholicism for a couple decades. Never joined the church. Never converted. My son found traditional Latin Mass, which is the part of the church that does not embrace Vatican II. It's what Pope Francis is trying to kill. And he's like, you guys really need to see this. So my dabbling to that point had been, Mass a few times a year and a congregation whose average age was probably 70, almost no children in the church. And went to this Latin Mass, and it was incredible. It was, the average age was probably like 17. A very, very strong, spiritual desire for mystical union, as you were saying. And it really gives me hope. So I've talked a lot to the clergy about it, and it's like, it's not an isolated incident. That part of the church is exploding. The young people, 20-somethings are coming to it and finding it. I don't know if there's an analogous situation with Protestantism, but it's really exciting to me that I think there is an awareness, this desire that it's been completely purged, and now people feel that need and are finding it. So it's hopeful in my mind.
I think I am optimistic as well too. Right now, North American Protestantism still lives under the shadow of the managerial church and the church growth movement. That growing churches is, organizational success is the thing, right? My sense of it is the same. People are going to be, those that are getting disaffected and going to, say, the Orthodox or Latin Mass and converting and so forth. There are going to be those like myself. Like, I grew up it's an ethnic church. Like I could, but it wouldn't be home. Like, all the people I know, I have a real community of people, like multi-generational, and that ties around sort of the Dutch Reformed community. And so it's, for me, becoming Orthodox is not just something I do. And I think there's others like that who will be part of the Protestant church and even non-denominational churches who are going to, look at their guys that are converting to Orthodoxy, and they might dabble with that. But I think they're going to come to the realization that we can do a heroic spirituality here in our own churches, and that we don't have to become something that really dispensationally we're not, that we can remain fundamentally what we are, which is Protestant, and we can just seek divine union here. I mean, it's funny, all the theology is really there in Protestant, in the historic denominational teaching. There were just other things that were emphasized. And so all of that stuff can be exhumed and reinvigorated, I think, with actual practice. And I think it's going to happen. But it's, we're really right now, us here are on the cusp of something that's going to start gaining steam in the next decade or so.
Can you just unpack really quick? You glossed over something that really intrigued me. Organizational success and church growth. I mean, in the Protestant circles where I come from, I mean, that's everything. That's the thing.
That's everything.
And I'd love to have you unpack that just a little bit.
Okay. I'm looking at the clock too, so I've got to start thinking about it. Yeah, that's fine. We'll take this too. This comes back to the piece that you mentioned early on about managerial Christianity. So it becomes, I think, a misunderstanding, or how do you put it? A cultural adaptation. So we in the West, following the rise of the managers, or the bourgeois merchant class, as they rose in power, those types of sensibilities took hold. And so there is this sense where people say, like, we need to run a church more like a business. Right? So what you end up having is this sort of adaptation to what we might call power, but it was the power of a previous age, of this era of the post-war consensus, of a world that was still saw Christianity as a net good. And so you get busy doing it. So you take these passages like go and make disciples of all nations, and you translate that, and you take the words and then you fill it with content from a business environment. So what's a business environment about? Well, it's about measurables. So you begin to look at, so how do we fulfill this idea of go and make disciples of all nations? Well, we have to be successful in making the unchurched churched, and bringing them in and putting bodies in the pews, getting them to make a confession, and so forth and so forth. But when you look at the process of what Jesus was doing, and if you really read the Gospels with a sensitive eye, that a lot of what Jesus was doing was teaching his disciples how to have faith. Take, for example, the story of the feeding of the 5,000, right? So the disciples approach Jesus and say, hey, you need to send the crowds home. They've been here a while. They have nothing to eat. And what does Jesus say? He says, well, you feed them, right? And they go back to committee, and they come back to Jesus kind of thing, well, we've only got like a handful of loaves, and we don't really have enough. So Jesus, exasperated, basically here, like, give them to me. And he prays, and he feeds the 5,000. Then he does it again with the 4,000. There's also in there the story. This is all in the Gospel of Matthew. There's a story of him walking on water. So he called Peter, come to, if it really is, Lord, you tell me to come. And he takes his eyes off Jesus and starts to sink. Why did you lack faith? Then at the conclusion of this in Matthew 16, there's a story, where he says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And in the other gospel, it's the Herodians and the Sadducees. So, or the Pharisees and the Herodians. So you have basically two types of, like, what I would call like ciphers for, one is a kind of formal religiosity of the Pharisees. The other is a kind of political faith that you had in the Sadducees, right? So you can either have a political faith or a formal faith. But what does Jesus say in response? The disciples completely misunderstand that. And the question he asks them following that is, how many loaves were left after if we fed the 5,000? How many loaves were left after the 4,000? And he basically left just sort of it hanging. So there's the question of he's trying to teach the disciples that the heart of the church is not built through politics. It's not built through formal religious structures, but it's built through the power of God operating in anything. So what did we call the 12? Well, we called the 12 his disciples. So I get to think, after reading the Gospels, is a sense of like, okay, I've done this process with you guys. I've taught you how to believe. I've taught you how to have faith. I've given you the basics of what you need to know, how to read the scriptures properly to understand how they're being fulfilled in this moment. Now go and do likewise. And so we put bums in the pews, but we don't teach people how to have faith. And so this is kind of, and to do so, well, we will have, we have a very democratized version of it, right? So we will have people who, we talk about accountability groups. Accountability groups is not disciple making. Disciple making is hierarchical. Yeah. And this is why, in a sense, getting rid of the monasteries was a terrible thing, because, even when it's done badly in a sinful world, it always will be, right? But there was the abbot was in charge of your spiritual life. And part of becoming a monk was submitting to the authority of the abbot, who was then the guide in your spiritual journey of questing for what we have been talking about of meeting God. And so you submit to that.
You're going to make me too happy. Yeah, right? Submission was the key word I came up with in my my path. And we're teaching generations the complete opposite of submission.
Exactly.
Right? That's
yeah. You can just go and figure it out for yourself.
Yeah.
Which is and we don't make disciples. And so, but what we are really good at is using technique to build churches. And we're good at adapting churches to what people want. Entertainment.
Yeah. Versus, and for me, for the Catholic Church, for this Latin Mass pre-Vatican II, it's the sacrifice of the Mass. It's not entertainment. It's not even in your language. It's not your vernacular. You were there for a different purpose. You're celebrating Christ's sacrifice. So it's interesting. That's a Very
Yeah, so
wise point.
that's kind of my, and I think if you look at where is the big black hole now, the question is if you're successful in making disciples, there is always the sense of, you know, people's actions will often follow power, and this is why when you were able to convert, like when the king, you see this story in the scriptures, Cornelius converts and his whole household becomes Christian. Now, did they all believe in the same way that Cornelius did? Probably not, right? But they were all now baptized. And so there is this sense, and this is why I think that the older idea of seeking God as a vocation, like the monk did, is an example thing. So yeah, in theory, I suppose you could create the structures to scale up discipleship, to disciple every single person in all of society with that sort of hierarchical master servant type of thing. But then you would have a sort of technological, you'd be back at the problem of the technological society. So in a sense, really what you're trying to do, and this is the conclusion that I've come to, and others of us have realized, that the whole model of evangelism, where you're trying to, based on the sort of a democratic model of trying to convince people through argumentation, is fundamentally flawed, in the sense of that if you win over the head of the household, the family converts. And if if that head of the household is also the leader of the tribe, the whole tribe converts. And then within that tribe, there will be those who submit themselves to discipleship, and their example then will be an example to others who will then do that in part. Now, maybe everybody submits themselves willingly to the discipleship, but I think there is a sense of, you work down from the leadership class, or the that having these exemplars of a class of people within your society who pursue faith, who pursue God in a heroic manner that way, are a net benefit for society, because it creates the example of, like, even if it's the archetype. So even if you only do what the monk does in part, right? You do the best you can, given all of the compromises you have to have in order to have a wife, a kids, and a business. And the monk may dedicate his life to do that, but you cannot dedicate your life to prayer. Otherwise, if everybody in society dedicates their life to prayer, nobody eats, nobody whatever, we're dead in a generation. So from a practical perspective, some of our lives will be divided. But then, we have to recognize that even if I'm not a monk and I haven't dedicated my life to prayer, that my fundamental discipling relationship still has to be hierarchical. When I go to the pastor or I go to the priest, I recognize that when I'm talking to him, it's not an accountability relationship between equals, but it's a relationship of submission. So that way, when the priest or the pastor says to me, calls me to account, or hears my confession, or, he's listened to me talk about the state of my spiritual life, and he says, here's what I think you should do, that then you submit in obedience and you do it, So, and it'll take different flavors, I think, depending on, so you might go into the Catholic Church and he says, I want you to do, 50 Hail Marys a day. Right. Or, Our Fathers a day. And the other one says, I want you to spend, dedicate a half hour to scripture reading and prayer time in the morning before you go to work, and come back to me in 2 weeks and talk about how that went. Right. These types of things. But it's a hierarchical relationship of disciple making, and it'll be grades, I think, various on what our role in society demands of us. So.
Yep. Kruptos, wow, what a great conversation. Thanks so much for joining us on Philosofuture.
A lot of fun, guys. Yeah, we should do this again.
Yeah, let's do it.
Absolutely.
There's so many things we didn't touch on.
Yeah,
next time.
There's a lot of stuff we didn't touch on. Yeah, next time. Very good.